Dear Void, I saw this interview on the Winston Marshall podcast with a guy called Raymond Ibrahim, and I'm going to leave a link to the entire interview in the description. Now, Ibrahim is a scholar with a background in history, and he is primarily interested in the Christian-Muslim relations and history. He himself is from an Egyptian Coptic background. To those who don't know, that means Christian, and he's, let's say, not a fan of Islam. Personally, I've viewed a few of his videos on YouTube. He seems to be one of those who expose Islam by taking specific passages from the Quran and the Hadith and showing how ridiculous or sometimes violent and disgusting they are. I'm not really into that kind of stuff. I've studied religious studies in university, and I can do that with Judaism and Christianity and fucking Hinduism if I wanted to. Every religion on earth has idiotic, sometimes violent and disgusting passages. Welcome to the human mind. But when he talks about history, that's when I find him a bit interesting. Although perhaps not always for the reasons that he would like. Now, to be fair, a good thing to say is that he does illuminate parts of history that are usually being hidden from people. For example, he would talk about the Muslim conquest of the Christian world in a much more accurate or at least layered way than it usually being taught. Like he points out, people in the West don't even know that a majority of the Middle East used to be Christian. Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, Turkey, North Africa, all of those regions were Christian. And they were converted by force, by barbarity into Islam. Islam didn't just spread through the region. Islam was forced through the region. That is the factual truth. So he is absolutely correct to point that out. And he is also absolutely correct to point out that this little historical truth is being whitewashed in schools in the West. That most people just think the Middle East was always Muslim. It most certainly was not. But the second thing that makes him interesting to me is that he represents, in my eyes, the Christianity that has never changed. A Christianity where Jews don't exist or shouldn't be considered or taken into account. And every time he gives an interview like this, the interviewer, which is usually a person with a political agenda themselves and not as knowledgeable in the history of the Middle East and the Muslim conquests as one would hope, would not challenge him on that or on other things that he says. Now, you know a historian has an agenda when they say something that is absolutely categorically wrong, and that they know that what they say is wrong. And it takes someone who is also knowledgeable of that topic to catch them at that. And that's the magic of the internet. And why the internet is also dangerous to the human mind. Because the layman would hear Ibrahim talks, and 80% of what he says is true, and they'll take his words at face value. And then he'll give them this little tidbit.
We're now nearing to what traditionally was called the Dark Ages, because we have, which, by the way, and we can get into, is a product of Islam. Okay, and many people don't know this. So the Mediterranean used to be known as kind of the Roman lake, and everyone, Egypt and Syria and all of North Africa and Europe were all connected. It was part of one empire. After Islam took everything basically south of that, North Africa and the Middle East, and I already told you that was the richer, more profound, the more sophisticated region. Little Europe, the rest of the Christian was cut off completely. Papyrus ended. It used to come from Egypt. That supply was eliminated. All of that is historically, was the beginning of what historians would call the Dark Ages.
I'm sorry, but that is categorically incorrect. To say that Islam is the cause of the intellectual decline in Europe is absolutely false and reeks of political agenda. So why did Islam suffer intellectual decline and entered what we call the Dark Ages? Not because there wasn't any papyrus to write on, for fuck's sakes, that's just ridiculous. Okay, first of all, the chronology doesn't really add up. By 467 AD, the Roman Empire has collapsed. The Arab conquest didn't take place until 2 centuries later. And when it started, most of Europe was already illiterate. Not to mention that the papyrus was already replaced by parchment by the 3rd century AD. So you see, this is an outrageous claim, a ridiculous attempt at trying to shift the blame, to vilify the Muslims and to exonerate Europe by saying, it's not that we were dumb, it's that the Muslims made us dumb. And you know what? That's kind of dumb. So why did Europe suffer this intellectual decline? 2 main reasons. One, because when the Roman Empire fell, the authorities and traditions of learning and going to school fell and crumbled with them. Schools were not maintained and people did not bother to send their children to school even if they had the option. So did its priorities. And second, and this is the actually big one, the fucking Catholic Church. By the time the Muslims start their conquest in the 7th century, Western Europe has already declined. Most of the population is already illiterate, and the church is the only literate institute. And they, unlike Muslims at the time, focused only on theology and scripture, not science and philosophy. In fact, that was discouraged by them. While in the Muslim world, at that time, being a scholar meant knowing philosophy and physics and maths and being familiar with the Quran, yes, but also the ancient Greek writings. And then, of course, even long after the Muslim conquests, the Catholic Church actively encouraged the ignorance of the masses and prevented them from acquiring knowledge in order to keep power in their own hands. They wanted the masses, what they call the laity, to be dependent on them, so they had to keep them illiterate. You don't need to learn how to read and write because the priests and bishops can do that for you. Which is why they also forbidden any translations of our unauthorized sequel to our Bible, or indeed even translations of the Hebrew Bible into local languages. The Council of Toulouse in 1229 had this famous decree. We prohibit also that the laity should be permitted to have the books of the Old or the New Testament, but we must strictly forbid their having any translation of these books. Another council a few years later in Tarragona repeated the same decree. And this was enforced by very extreme measures throughout the generations. In 1536, the church executed one William Tyndale officially for heresy. But what heresy did he commit? Translating the Bible into English. And even worse, his translation tried to be loyal to the original meanings and spirit of the text. And so instead of church, he used congregation. And instead of priest, he used elder. So the church saw that as a threat to their power, and they banned the translation and they executed the man. In short, Europe declined into the Dark Ages because of the fall of the Roman Empire and the rise of the Catholic Church. And it was the Catholic Church that kept it in the dark for centuries. In the dark and under their boots. So when modern Westerners look at the Muslim world today and they go, look at those primitives with their only religion and no science or culture, for one thing, that is incorrect, factually incorrect these days and ignorant. Most of the Arab world, or the Muslim world even, is not the Taliban or Hamas or ISIS. And for another, you guys were all the same. The Catholic Church was the Taliban, basically. It took time for Europeans to put it in its proper place, the back seat. Now, a lot of Ibrahim's points in this interview and in other videos of his are meant to justify and exonerate the Crusades. And many of his points are good points. He rebels against the idea that the Crusades were these evil quests of barbarians against simple civilized Muslims, which is the ridiculous narrative you hear in the West a lot these days, especially, unfortunately, in left-leaning circles. But also Ibrahim adopts a very simplistic and misleading narrative of his own. And again, this is where you see the bias, the agenda coming out. Because he's trying to make it appear as if the Crusades were a response to the Muslim conquest and the bad thing that Muslims did to Christians, which in part they were. But one should point out that the First Crusade takes place 450 years after the start of the Muslim conquests. So that's one hell of a slow response time. If Europe was a gaming monitor, you'd throw it in the trash. It wasn't just about that. The Muslim conquests and the way the Muslim treated Christians and raided Christian areas were used to justify the Crusades and incite the public, and you may even say that they did justify them. That's fine. But there was also a grab of power by the Catholic Church, an attempt to establish itself above all Christendom, to unite Latin churches with Greek churches under its governance. There were power moves behind it as well. But the thing that makes me as a Jew both laugh out loud and be annoyed at the same time is when Ibrahim says stuff like this.
If you asked earlier historians, in the 1800s, they would tell you the Crusades were motivated by love. They were actually, and it comes out in some of the sources where the Crusaders were moved by Christ's injunction to love your fellow man as much as yourself and to love God. So they were loving God because they wanted to go and liberate the Holy Sepulchre. They wanted to liberate the Holy Land, which was very important. Again, this is something modern people don't understand, but place was important. Holy sacred land.
The Crusades were an act of love, and they wanted to liberate the Holy Land. Let's first talk about Christian love, the good old Christian love. When the Muslims occupied Jerusalem, us Jews, we didn't exactly, have a Nagila. But the Muslims left the Jews alone for the most part. Jerusalem had a few synagogues in it, and there was a flourishing community allowed to live in their homeland, in their ancient capital, without being molested too much. Then the Crusaders came, apparently motivated by love, and the first thing they did was to burn down those synagogues with the people inside. You can basically hear the Beatles in the background going, love, 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 right? Can you hear that? Isn't Christian love just the bestest of all the loves? And then, of course, there's they wanted to liberate the Holy Land. Really, they were going to liberate it. So they were going to give it back to the original natives, which is us. We, who actually were the first in history to refer to that area as a Holy Land? Of course not. They meant to murder all Jews, like Westerners always do, and this time also all Muslims, and occupy the land for themselves. But they call it liberate it. And they still use those terms to this day. The lack of self-awareness is astounding. And now, of course, the same tricks are used against us by another generation of Westerners. We, the fucking natives, are the colonialists. And the Arabs who invaded the area and used the Greek name for it are the natives. And we stole the land from them. That's right, Jews who got their name from Judea stole Judea. It doesn't matter if it's 1095 or 2025, in the eyes of Westerners, the Crusaders, the modern pro-antisemitism who pretend to be pro-Palestinians, we do not exist, or shouldn't exist, or we don't matter. Our land is theirs to do with as they please, our lives is there to take. Nothing fucking changes. Look, on a historical debate between Muslims and Christians, Jewish historians can, in general, be a little more objective than either of those, because Christians take over, Muslims take over, we're dead anyway. So we don't have a horse in that race. But history has to be told from an all-encompassing point of view to be truly objective. You are discussing a land that is not yours, not theirs, and never was, and you are completely ignoring the actual natives or what your Christian love did to them. And that does not make for a very good historian. You're basically doing the exact same thing you complain that the other side, the leftists and Muslims, are doing. They have their agenda, you have your own agenda. You both are basically gang raping the truth for your own entertainment. And honestly, I'm unimpressed with both.